Imagine a robbery where the main weapon isn't a gun but the police code 39s, a signal that causes all the cops to drop everything and rush to the crime scene without even suspecting that this is exactly what the criminals want them to do. The events took place in Atlanta, Georgia. The headlines were abuzz with the arrest of the Russian-Israeli mobster Vasily. In the wake of this, in order to secure his release from prison, a group of 5 armed men, including former Special Forces operatives and corrupt police officers, planned a heist. Their leader is Michael Atwood. They work for the imprisoned mobster's ruthless wife, Irina Vlasova. The group pulled up to the bank in broad daylight and stormed in through the main entrance, while their driver, Russell, waited around the corner, keeping an eye on the situation. The group planned to intimidate the employees. They showed the manager photos of his family, threatened him, and under duress ordered him to open the designated safe deposit box. Number 815, one of the gang members, Gabe, grabbed the stacks of cash that were lying nearby. Russell announced that the police would be there in just 2 minutes. Robbers fled the bank, planting an explosive device on their way out. The group got into a car they'd prepared in advance and were already celebrating their success, but suddenly smoke containing red paint began to pour out of a bag. They were leaving a trail behind them and could barely see where they were going. The spray can had dyed their suits red, so they decided to switch cars and stole one from a man on the road. They blew up the previous car to get rid of the evidence. As it turned out, the bank manager had planted the paint surprise in the bundles of cash. After driving a safe distance away, the group began to argue. The operation nearly fell apart because of the greed of one of the members, Gabe. Their target was exclusively the bank's safe deposit box, but Gabe took the bundles of cash with the surprise. Marcus and Franco, who are police detectives in addition to being part of the robbery crew, were particularly furious with Gabe. During the argument, Franco pulled out a gun, but their leader, Michael, defused the situation. They got rid of the car and went their separate ways. Russell is Gabe's older brother. He had warned his brother about the future. Later, Russell defended Gabe to Michael. Gabe has been in rehab for addiction for half a year now, so he asks to be given another chance. Michael arrived at Irina's group and brought the contents of the safe deposit box. Meanwhile, Detective Jeffrey Allen arrived at the scene of the robbery. As it turned out, the safe deposit box belonged to a wealthy Russian. The bank manager explained that he had fallen for the gang's provocation and opened the box because it contained all the information about his family. Allen, however, dismissed his concerns, calling it a crude trap. Since Marcus and Franco were active-duty police officers, Marcus went to work. They operated on both sides of the law, using their police badges to avoid suspicion and remain unnoticed after committing crimes. They were notified of a robbery at a city bank when suddenly Marcus noticed red paint on his pant leg and tried to cover it with his foot. They were introduced to a new police officer, Chris, who is Detective Allen's nephew, and as if to make matters worse, he was assigned as Marcus's partner. There was no news from the gang leader. Michael arrived at Irina's place where he met his biological son, Felix. The boy is the child of Michael and Elena is Irina's biological sister. Since Irina heads a mafia group while her husband is in prison, she uses her family connections to manipulate people. Suddenly, Irina announced that she would not pay for the job, since the documents from the safe weren't enough, and she forced Michael and the gang to carry out another heist, this time a raid on the DHS office. They must steal documents containing information about Irina's husband, the mafia leader, which are necessary to free him from the Russian Gulag prison. Michael called Russell and explained the situation, but just as he hung up, a member of the Russian-Israeli mafia, acting on Irina's orders, attacked Russell in his car. Since Michael was hesitating to carry out the second, extremely difficult task, the mafia decided to send him a stern warning. They attacked Russell to show Michael what could happen to him or his son Felix if he refused to cooperate. Michael gathered his crew, but Russell wasn't there. The crew didn't like the idea of yet another mission, and Franco blamed Michael for everything. However, they were all in this together now because, as Michael had seen earlier, Irina had been in contact with the feds. Suddenly, in the middle of the conversation, Russell's car pulled up but crashed into a wall. Russell himself was barely alive, but it was clear to everyone that he wouldn't survive. He was simply suffering through his final moments, but Michael put him out of his misery with a single shot. Russell was no longer alive, and everyone was in despair. Suddenly, Irina's phone rang. It was Michael, but she didn't answer. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Allen and a colleague began analyzing the surveillance footage of the robbery. The woman noted that the robbers clearly had combat training. The gang had already realized they had no choice but to carry out Irina's orders. Otherwise, someone else among them would suffer. Franco suggested using the 3-9s method. 3-9s is an actual police code, meaning an officer is wounded. When this code code is broadcast over the radio, all police forces halt their current operations and rush to the scene at top speed to assist their wounded colleague and apprehend the assailant. This would give them enough time to break into the heavily guarded Ministry of Internal Security office unhindered and steal the files the mafia needed. The next morning, Marcus and his new partner Chris, who worked in the anti-gang division, responded to a call in a residential neighborhood. 3 severed heads were found at the crime scene, displayed on the hood of a car. Chris wanted to question the gang standing nearby, but the gang leader belittled him and refused to talk. Eventually, Chris handcuffed the leader. Marcus stepped aside to talk to Chris and criticized his methods, emphasizing that this was the street and different rules applied here. Chris had offended Luis Pinto, so now his gang definitely wouldn't talk. Chris didn't appreciate such lectures, so he told Marcus not to interfere with his work. Later, Michael discussed the 3-9's plan with Franco and Marcus. They were confident they'd gain not just 10 minutes, but at least a whole day without police at the robbery scene. Michael agreed, then took Gabe and drove off to bury Russell. Meanwhile, after work, Detective Allen met with his nephew Chris. Allen considered Chris's idealism and desire for justice to be laughably naive. He reminds Chris that his main and only real task for the day is to return home alive every evening. He believes that survival is the #1 priority in this corrupt city and tries to protect Chris and his family. Later, Michael invited his son and his ex-wife Elena over. He tried to find out from her why Irina wasn't answering his calls. The next morning, Michael drove his son home and stopped by Irina's place to tell her he'd agreed to carry out the assignment. At Chris's house, his wife noticed he was upset, and he complained to her about his partner. Meanwhile, in the sauna, Michael and his allies were planning the heist. Marcus and Franco intended to take out Chris specifically because as soon as Jeffrey Allen heard that something had happened to him, the entire city police force would surely gather there. Gabe just listened in silence, still mourning his brother. Later, Gabe spoke with Michael about the plan. He had doubts about the morality of such actions and was certain that Russell would have found another way out. In response, Michael kicked Gabe out of the car. The next morning, Marcus and Chris were at work and drove to meet with members of Luis Pinto's gang. Chris waited by the car. Marcus went into the house to meet secretly with Pinto and work out the details. He gave the gangster information about where and when Chris would be so that Pinto could take him out. It would all seem plausible since his gang had a grudge against Chris following the conflict. Meanwhile, Allen met with his informant, Svit Pai, who is a club manager and a longtime source of Allen's. For some extra cash, she revealed that one of her club's employees had mentioned a customer, a guy splattered with red paint, who had robbed a bank. Meanwhile, Chris and Marcus were keeping an eye on Fernando, who had recently been released from prison. A group of police officers led by Chris had already gone after him with an arrest warrant. He was suspected of committing the crime involving the severed heads on the hood. Large-scale police raid began in the gang's residential area and a shootout ensued. The police kicked down the door to the apartment. It was full of illegal substances. They searched room by room. But the criminal wasn't inside, only his girlfriend. He was already out on the street and running away. Helicopters were dispatched to assist. Chris and his allies faced resistance from other gang members and exchanged fire while Fernando ran away as fast as he could. Suddenly, Chris moved closer on his own, thinking the gangster had put down his weapon. But it was just a trap. Fernando pulled out another gun and shot Chris right in the chest. Marcus checked on Chris. He was unharmed, so Marcus continued chasing the criminal. Chris went to look for Marcus and saw him in a standoff with the criminal. And without hesitation, Chris fired a bullet at Fernando. After everything had calmed down and Chris had been questioned, Marcus and Chris went out for a drink together. Meanwhile, Irina met with Michael. She handed him the phone to talk to his son Felix, who told him that he was currently with his mom by the sea and that Irina would be joining them soon. As it turned out, they were in Israel in the city of Eilat. Michael realized what Irina was up to. She was threatening to harm his son if things didn't go according to plan. She gave him the codes to the gate for the robbery. Meanwhile, Gabe had relapsed into his addiction. Marcus and Chris were at a club with their colleagues when Gabe suddenly approached Marcus and wanted to talk. They stepped aside and Marcus was outraged that Gabe would approach him while he was with his fellow police officers. It was too risky, so they got into a fight. Marcus explained to Chris that Gabe was his former informant. Allen was already actively digging up information on Gabe, and as it turned out, Gabe had served on the police force for 3 years before being fired for unjustified use of a firearm. The Allen had also been keeping an eye on the girl Gabe was with and caught her buying illegal substances. She revealed that Gabe spends a lot of time with Michael, and also that his brother Russell had died a few days earlier. The Allen's partner was still tailing Gabe and noticed that he had stopped near Chris's house. When Allen heard this, he ordered her to detain him. Gabe had been watching Chris from the window, but when he heard the police sirens, he ran away as fast as he could. Allen arrived on the scene and explained to Chris that Gabe was part of the gang they were looking for. Allen received a phone call explaining that Michael Atwood had previously worked as a special operations agent for Blackwater, and that in 2008, Michael and Russell were accused of smuggling weapons for a Russian mobster, Vasily Vlasov. But at that time, all the witnesses disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Marcus called Michael and told him that Gabe was being watched and that they would soon start watching Michael himself. Later, Michael found Gabe's girlfriend threatened her and sent a photo to Gabe. On the phone, Gabe begged him not to touch her and promised he'd disappear off the radar. Michael left her alone after all. The police searched for Michael at his residence, but he was no longer there. They called Franco and reported that Gabe had slipped away from the police while Michael was still being sought. Despite the problems, their plan remained unchanged. Now, it was time to pull off the final heist. The next business day, Marcus and Chris drove to what was supposedly the home of one of their informants. They arrived at an abandoned apartment complex. There were no signs of life there. Meanwhile, Franco and Michael were standing by ready to rob the DHS office. In the dark hallways, Chris lost sight of Marcus and called out to him, but there was no answer. Suddenly, Luis Pinto, the gang leader whom Marcus had hired to kill Chris, entered the building. Out of the blue, Chris ran into Gabe in the hallway. He tried to warn him that an assassination attempt was being planned against him, but Luis burst into the hallway and fired a shot. Shootout ensued, during which Gabe took a bullet meant for Chris. Luis had mistaken them for each other. Hearing the gunshots, Marcus, who had run off into the distant hallways, began to feel pangs of conscience. Chris used the radio to inform his colleagues of the situation. Chris tried to speak with Gabe while he was still alive. Suddenly, Marcus walked into the room, completely shocked and bewildered. In the final seconds of his life, Gabe fired on Marcus, who managed to fire a shot in return. Everything had gone completely off plan, and now Chris, instead of Marcus, announced the code 39s over the radio. When Franco and Michael heard the 39 signal, they launched their operation. They drove up in a van and opened the gate using the code Irina had given them earlier. Incapacitated the police officer at the entrance with a stun gun and went inside. Meanwhile, the police were rushing to the scene, and Allen heard that Chris was there. On the way, they heard a report of a robbery at the DHS office. Michael and Franco threatened the security guards by attaching explosive devices to them. Under pressure, the guards followed the criminals' every order. Michael injured one of the guards' legs to show he wasn't bluffing. However, things weren't that simple. There was a lock with a clockwork mechanism that none of the guards present could open. Michael attached explosives and blew up the door, now clearing the way to the cells. He began drilling through the cell wall while the police were already on their way to them. At the exit, 4 police patrols were already waiting for the criminals, but Michael pointed to the button that would trigger the hostages' explosives, so they didn't attack. When Detective Allen arrived at the scene, he saw Chris alive and unharmed. Marcus was taken by helicopter to the hospital. Chris explained that he had earlier seen Gabe and Marcus get into an argument at the bar, but he didn't know the details. Franco changed his clothes and quickly arrived at the scene since he's also a police officer. Meanwhile, Michael went to a meeting with the mafia. As always, they searched him. Irina came to the meeting in person. He handed her a briefcase containing information on her husband and asked to see his son, Felix. Irina told Michael to take his payment for the job but to stop looking for Felix. Michael loved his son and had brought a gift, but Irina took it, saying she would give it to Felix on her own behalf. But Michael wasn't a fool. When they left, he got into the car and used his phone to activate the explosive device that had been hidden inside the toy gift Irina had taken. No one survived the explosion. Meanwhile, Marcus underwent surgery at the hospital. Chris was informed that Luisa Pinto had been eliminated by special forces. Chris went over to Louise's personal belongings that had been left behind, and suddenly he saw a piece of paper with an address and a time, the same place and time he and Marcus had been. That's when he understood everything. Meanwhile, as Michael was driving through the city in the middle of the night, the police pulled him over. Michael had already drawn his gun, but as it turned out, it was Franco. He pretended to be friendly, but suddenly said goodbye, fired a shot, and killed Michael. Franco took all the money for himself. The next day, to get to the bottom of everything, Chris went to see members of Luis Pinto's gang. There, he met the teenager he'd spoken with while Marcus was in the house. Chris learned that Marcus had been making arrangements with Luis that day. Franco had been watching their conversation. Later, Chris went to see Jeffrey Allen. Chris put forward his version of events. He was now certain that Marcus had made a deal with the gang leader to have Chris killed. The picture of the gang members was taking shape: Michael, Marcus, and Gabe, but they still didn't know who the fourth person was. As it turned out, Gabe's girlfriend had also been killed recently. It was Franco who had covered up the evidence. Chris went to the hospital to visit Marcus when Franco suddenly walked into the room, pretending he needed to take a statement from Chris about the events and asking him to come with him to the police station. Chris agreed to go with Franco, and as they got into the elevator, the phone rang. It was Alan who revealed that Franco was the fourth man. At first, Chris didn't let on that he knew the truth and just kept talking to Franco. They went out to the parking lot, and Franco walked to his car. When he got inside, Alan was already waiting for him there and shot him. Chris got into his car, heard the gunshot, and immediately called for backup. That's it. Have you seen the whole movie? Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the Movie Fish channel so you don't miss out on interesting movie plots.